Hi, everyone, friends near and far. Welcome to our event with Kapil Komireddi for his debut, Malevolent Republic, A Short History of the New India. He'll be in conversation today with special guest Graham Stewart. I'm Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Without further ado, happy to introduce today's stars. Graham Stewart is the political editor of the Critic Magazine in London, a senior research fellow in 20th century British history at the Humanities Research Institute of Buckingham University, an official historian of the Times of London, and the author of 6 books, including the critically acclaimed Friendship and Betrayal, Ambition and the Limits of Loyalty. And KS, or Kapil Satish Komireddi, was born in India and was educated there and in England. His commentary, criticism, and journalism from South Asia, Europe, and the Middle East have appeared among other leading publications in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Indian Express, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, Time, Foreign Policy, the Spectator, and the Jewish Chronicle. In 2019, his op-ed highlighting the Indian government's brutality in Kashmir provoked an angry demonstration by Prime Minister Narendra Modi's supporters outside the offices of the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. A highly regarded observer of modern India, Komireddi is one of only 2,300 individuals that Modi follows on Twitter. Modi himself has 66 million followers. He's a contributor to Monocle 24 Radio. Malevolent Republic is his first book. Kapil, congratulations on the book. And Graham, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to stop talking and turn it over to you two. Everybody, thanks for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Evan, and thank you to Booksmith for hosting this event. I'm Graham Stewart, and I'd like to start by asking Kapil about Malevolent Republic, and particularly in the opening chapter, you introduced some aspects of your own childhood experiences, the fact you had a friendship with a Muslim schoolmate in Hyderabad, someone who was later tortured by the authorities, and you weave some of your own experiences with the history of post-independence India, the young republic, partition, and the pain that involved. But also you make very clear that some of the problems you speak about in Modi's India, particularly the decline of secularism and the increase of Hindu nationalism, really long predate the 1990s. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that period after independence and weaving in with that some of your own experiences of the fragility of the secular republic.
Well, thank you, Graham, and thank you for everybody joining in, and thank you to Booksmith and to Evan for hosting this event. To answer your question, I begin this book with a personal recollection of a friend of mine. I was sent to an Islamic seminary, a madrasa, by my parents, primarily because they wanted to inoculate me in later life against any prejudice against Muslims. This was because I grew up in Hyderabad. I was born there, and that is the only city in central southern India which was affected by the religious partition of India. Partition is often imagined as something that happened in Bengal and in Punjab, but Hyderabad was also a city that suffered the consequences, the ravages of partition. And my family were caught up in the maelstrom, and they wanted to inoculate me against any anti-Muslim prejudice. And I grew up in an India that really was very confident in its secularism. I remember an early conversation, Graham, where somebody, when somebody dismissed the idea that the BJP could ever form a government in Delhi, even then that seemed pretty complacent, because what we think of as Hindu nationalism had already made significant inroads throughout India by then. And let me just explain how the origins of Hindu nationalism and how it grew. Hindu nationalism really begins to acquire a political shape and political force in the 1920s. What we think of Hindu nationalists, their antecedents, were really a political pressure group within the Congress Party, the umbrella movement for India's freedom from Britain. And they wanted to put pressure. This was a newly politically conscious community that wanted to put pressure on the Congress Party. In 1921, after the collapse of the caliphate in Turkey, there was a massacre of Hindus in Malabar in southern India by very angry Muslims agitated because of the collapse of the caliphate. And the Congress Party didn't really react with any force. It didn't condemn that massacre. And that was a moment of disillusionment for many of these newly politically conscious Hindus who saw themselves primarily as Hindus. They split from the Congress, and in 1925, one of them founded a group called the RSS, which is the mothership of Hindu nationalism, that wanted to create a political community in India that saw itself primarily as Hindus. And about this time, a man called V.D. Savarkar writes the blueprint of Hindu nationalism, in which he describes Hindus as the original inhabitants of India, and everyone else can become an Indian, provided he or she first subscribes to Hinduism. And Muslims are explicitly excluded from this category because their holy land is in Arabia, and they can therefore not be Hindus, and therefore not Indians. But it's very important to remember that the market for this ideology is really restricted to upper caste Hindu men. There is really no market. It's only after the partition of India, when a state is created for the Muslims of India, that people begin to agree with the argument that once a state has been created for the Muslims of India, what remains must logically therefore be the state of India's Hindus. This is an argument rejected by Mahatma Gandhi and by Nehru, who's the first Prime Minister of India, who says India will never respond to the provocation of partition by becoming a Hindu Pakistan. He says India will be a secular country in which religion is incidental to your citizenship. It's not a criterion for membership of the state. And Mahatma Gandhi is gunned down by a Hindu nationalist, by a bigot who blames him for partition and for being too charitable to Muslims. And Hindu nationalists, as a result, are driven out of Delhi. They do not get a seat at the table. And they regroup, they farm out into the villages and towns and hamlets of India, and they propagate a revolution from the bottom up. And by the 1980s, they make a breakthrough because the secular establishment of India, which is the Congress Party, has become spectacularly corrupt and has been overtaken by the Gandhi dynasty. And they lose their credibility, the values for which the Congress Party stands. And the Congress Party is really indistinguishable from the state. Those values lose the sheen. And as a result of that, Hindu nationalists make significant inroads in the 1980s. And by 1990s, people like my friend, whom I grew up with, who had this naive belief in retrospect in Indian secularism, thinking that it would protect him, really began to collapse. And it was during the rule by a Congress party, but by a Congress government, that he was picked up and tortured for a crime he never committed. And I begin with that recollection, and I use that as a peg to unpack this history of India.
Well, the critics in India and in the United Kingdom have obviously given very favorable reviews at the release of Malevolent Republic. They focus a lot on what you have to say about Modi and the last years since 2014 in India, but they also are very intrigued by what you have to say about this period before this, the period of National Congress domination of Indian politics, and particularly the Gandhi family. The Gandhis in, I think, a lot of Western countries, they tend to get quite a good press. You're seen as secular, technocratic, progressive figures. You don't cut them that much slack. In what way do you see them as responsible for many of the problems that India finds itself in today?
The principal problem with them is the dynasty. They introduced the idea of dynasticism into Indian democracy. Now they argue that, this is the way things are in India. All Indian parties are run by dynasties, and Congress is one of the dynasties. This is a spurious argument because it's really a form of Hindu fatalism to say that this is how things are and they will always be that way. In 1915, when Mahatma Gandhi returned to India, India was a British colony, and he didn't sit there and say, this is how things will be. He mobilized Indians across the country and drove the British out peacefully. Congress became the preceptor party. India is democratic because Congress is democratic. Congress was democratic. Congress incubated Indian democracy. It is with the rise of Indira Gandhi in 1960s and 1966. She's the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, who was a Democrat to his core, attended Parliament, deferred to his colleagues in the cabinet, abased himself before the judiciary because he wanted to establish the supremacy, the superiority of the judiciary. After his death, for 2 years, there was another prime minister. And after that, Indira Gandhi, in a freak of history, was promoted to the premiership. And she had a really interesting exchange with an American journalist. She said to him, "Do you think any of these people can hold this thing together?" And he said, "By this thing, do you mean the Congress Party?" She said, "No, I mean India." And for the next 10 years, she converted India into a shackled audience for the squalid drama, her family drama that she enacted on India. By 1968, she split the party. And by 1971, she became the most formidable leader in India's history because she spearheaded the division of Pakistan. Pakistan, which was split into East Pakistan and West Pakistan, was effectively partitioned, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. This was largely due to her leadership. She led the intervention of India. She argued for intervention against the genocidal regime of West Pakistan. And after that, she became the most formidable leader in India. And she exploited that fame by attacking the institutions, the autonomous institutions on which the constitutional structure of India was raised. And she then converted the Congress Party into a family fief. Her older son, Sanjay Gandhi, effectively ran the show. And in 1975, a lower court passed an order effectively annulling her election to parliament because of some procedural violation. And she responded to that by declaring a state of internal emergency and suspending the constitution and ruling as a dictator for the next 21 months. And this is a period of pure terror in India. The copywriters of the government get busy. They come up with things like courage and clarity of vision. Thy name is Indira Gandhi. These phrases are pasted on billboards. And her son, Mrs. Gandhi's son, Sanjay Gandhi, decides he's a dropout. He's never done anything in his life. He's India's Ceausescu in so many respects. He decides that he wants to beautify India. So he orders the demolition of slums. Thousands of Muslims are displaced. He wants to build casinos in the Himalayas. And he decides that India's great problem is its population. So in order to curb the growth of India's population, he unlooses a reign of terror in the name of sterilizing people. There are roving sterilization squads that pick up men and mutilate them. Families and villages men hide in the farms because they don't want to be caught by these sterilization squads. By the end of the emergency, Sanjay Gandhi has succeeded in sterilizing 6.2 million Indian men. That is 15 times the number of men sterilized by the Nazis, to give you an idea. And during this time, the Indian intellectual gentry, rather than opposing this power grab, actually functions as a mouthpiece for the regime. They come up with mitigations. They say India is not really suited to democracy. Indians are not a people ready for democratic rule. They need enlightened despotism of the kind Indira Gandhi is supplying. But unable to bear the mounting criticism from the West, Indira Gandhi decides to announce elections in 1977 because her intelligence agents have assured her of victory. But it is the very same Indians who are thought to be unsuited to democracy who turn up at the ballot box and vote her out. She loses her own seat. Sanjay Gandhi loses his own seat. Congress is displaced, thrown out of power for the first time. This is, the greatest post-colonial political party, the largest political machine in Asia, the oldest political party in India. It's unthinkable. Congress is out of power. And this is an affirmation of Indian democracy, how deep Nehru's idea of an Indian democracy had percolated into the bones of ordinary Indians. But the tragedy here is that the norms of democracy, the manner in which you conduct democracy, has been shattered by them. And Indira Gandhi has created a template which her successors then come to abuse. Narendra Modi in so many ways is a tribute to Mrs. Gandhi's rule.
Well, I mean, obviously the Gandhi family are the dominant figures during this period, and what you say is pretty coruscating. It's important to say that in the book, there are also some rather more heroic figures. One of them is the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who you described as really one of the most consequential politicians in modern Indian history. He has been rather airbrushed out of Indian history, and for a Western audience, he's a very marginal figure indeed. Can you say rather more about why you think he's so consequential?
To appreciate the achievement of Narasimha Rao, you need to understand the condition of the country he inherited. In 1991, India was a country of 800 million people. It had 5 million telephone lines. To produce a vacuum cleaner, you needed a license. To import a computer, you needed to make 50 trips to New Delhi. And Coca-Cola was as contraband in India as alcohol is in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And India was governed by a state religion that called itself socialism. And as somebody said, its greatest achievement was to distribute poverty among Indians. Narasimha Rao had already retired from active politics. He'd endured triple bypass surgery. He was 70 years old. But in 1991, Rajiv Gandhi, the Gandhi dynast, Prime Minister of India, who'd been thrown out of office, was trying to stage a comeback, was assassinated by a Tamil tiger. And there was no family heir to take Rajiv Gandhi's post because Sanjay Gandhi had been killed in a freak air crash. Rajiv's wife, Sonia, was a recently naturalized Roman Catholic of Italian origin. Their children, Rahul and Priyanka, were 21 and 19 years old. So there was no family successor. And Congress Party was a beehive of factions. And by a process of elimination, Rao was picked as a successor to Rajiv Gandhi because he was viewed as the least harmful and most innocuous of all the candidates. And the people who elevated him to the top job, did it very much with the intention to dislodge him as soon as the elections concluded. Congress was voted into power on a wave of sympathy for Rajiv Gandhi, and immediately Rao bared his ruthless streak. He appointed Manmohan Singh from the University Grants Commission as his finance minister. $2 billion separated India from bankruptcy. India had run out of dollar reserves. And what Rao basically did is he started liberalizing India's economy, and he put his political capital on the line. India was founded upon 4 pillars: socialism, secularism, non-alignment in foreign affairs, and democracy. Rao took a hammer to all of them. The liberalization, the most consequential decisions in liberalizing India's economy were made by subverting Indian democracy. Prices were hiked when Parliament went into recess, and the most important decisions were made as executive decisions. Intelligence agencies' files on MPs were used to effectively coerce them into voting with the government. Secularism was compromised when Hindu nationalists went and tore down a medieval mosque, and the state really did nothing to hold them back, nor did it rebuild that mosque. Socialism was dead once the economy was liberalized. And non-alignment was dead because India's patron and lodestar, the Soviet Union, effectively collapsed after that. So Rao tilted India in the direction of Washington. And today's India, for better or for worse, is Rao's India. Rao dismantled the state religion of socialism, and India became wealthier than ever before in its history, but it also became incredibly unequal as a result of that. And he was written out of Congress Party's history when the Gandhi family reasserted its control in 1998, because he was the only member, as he said, of the Congress Party to serve a full term as the Prime Minister of India without belonging to the dynasty. And when he died, the bear bearing his body was not allowed to alight at the party headquarters. His wake was not allowed to take place in Delhi. His body was flown back to Hyderabad, and his funeral was very thinly attended. And he was reduced in death to a regional leader. In 1991, he was nominated alongside Chairman Deng as a Man of the Year. Margaret Thatcher visited him in retirement. The Christian Science Monitor, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, I believe, editorialized, hailing him at the peak of his power as the most transformative figure in India's history. But all of that was raised from the memory because he didn't belong to the family. And this bespeaks, I think, the pettiness of the dynasty. They wrote him out of history because, as he said, he wasn't a member of the dynasty. But today's India is inconceivable without the political will he displayed. I don't agree with everything he did. In fact, I think his legacy in many respects is very baleful, but he is a consequential prime minister. He played the same role in India's history that Chairman Deng played in China's, or Margaret Thatcher played in Britain's, or Ronald Reagan played in America's, and yet nobody knows him, nobody remembers him anymore. I find that extraordinary.
The politician who really picked up the legacy of Narasimha Rao is, of course, and you mentioned him a moment ago, Manmohan Singh, who was Prime Minister 2004 to 2014 for 10 years. This was a period where the liberalisation really started to have effect, the so-called India Shining period. Again, I mean, we were talking earlier about Western audiences having a rather higher opinion of the Gandhi dynasty than many people in India, and yourself included, think they should have. I mean, similarly with Manmohan Singh, who's a very widely regarded, not just politician, but economist to Western audiences. Barack Obama called him a statesman and a guide. You call him India's Pinochet, which is quite strong stuff. Why?
Right. So when Manmohan Singh delivered his first budget as Narasimha Rao's finance minister, that was in 91, he said, "I promise that in dealing with the people of India, I shall be soft-hearted." That was in 1991, because he said, "I'm liberalizing India's economy to benefit Indians, ordinary Indians, and I will not incinerate whatever safety net there is." But subsequently, when he became prime minister, the liberalization aspect of it became his state religion, and Indians became the impediment in achieving it, became the impediment in realizing his ambition to make that economics India's state religion. And what the prime minister did is he decided his government, during his government, by 2007, he became the prime minister in 2004. By 2007, India had become a $1 trillion economy. By 2009, India had added 42,000 people to the ranks of its dollar millionaires. By 2010, 8 of the richest people in the world were Indian. At the same time, on the other side of the ledger, 400 million Indians lived below the international poverty line in 2010, and 46% of all children were malnourished in 2011. A lot of people praise him for pulling millions of Indians out of poverty, but I think people were moved out of dire poverty and into barely tolerable destitution. The wealth that India created remained at the very top. It very rarely percolated to the bottom. P.V. Narasimha Rao, in one of his last speeches, actually bewailed the attitude of his successor to sell off state assets and to promote trickle-down economics in the belief that it would trickle down to the people most in need. And P.V. Narasimha Rao said, in my experience, that never tends to happen. And when resistance began piling up in the countryside, because there are people, the tribal populations of India sit above extraordinary mineral wealth that India's industrialists need to extract. Rather than engaging in conciliation and dialogue, Prime Minister Singh's government decided to send in the army. It started something called Operation Green Hunt, which moved the most sophisticated weapons into the most destitute parts of India to coerce people into giving what is theirs. And it even contemplated, this is extraordinary, it even contemplated using India's Air Force to put down what was an armed rebellion against his policies. I mean, there is a long-running armed insurgency against the Indian state, but that intensified during Prime Minister Singh's rule because of his policies, and his government contemplated using Indian Air Force, which the British, at the peak of their power, didn't. There's a minuted policy in which a British general says, we're not going on a hunt, we're ruling this country. Something that somehow missed the elected representatives of India serving in Manmohan Singh's government. And 16,000 farmers killed themselves for every year but 2 years that Manmohan Singh was prime minister, because they didn't have money to feed themselves. And they wrote suicide letters directly addressing the prime minister and blaming his policies for their decision to kill themselves. And it fell to the Supreme Court of India to upbraid him for pushing the poor, as it put it, to the wall and unleashing violence in the countryside with, and I quote, predatory forms of capitalism supported by the state. I worked with some of these people. I did pro bono work for people who were exposed to the roughest edges of Prime Minister Singh's enlightened rule. And what you discovered is, in the countryside, obviously the New Yorker called him, the most enlightened ruler in India's living history. But in the countryside, if you inhabited the shoes of these people, Prime Minister Singh didn't come across as the statesman feted in Washington. He came across as India's Pinochet, and that's why I use that description. He never won an election in his life. He was appointed to the job by Sonia Gandhi because she didn't want her Italian origin to become fodder for her critics, for her xenophobic critics. So she appointed him, and he was a loyal retainer to the Gandhi family, kept the prime minister's office warm for Rahul Gandhi in the hope that he would win the election in 2014. But he had no contact, no avenue for contact with ordinary Indians. He never won an election in his life. He never asked, he never knew what it was like to seek votes. He was never responsive to ordinary Indians. And by the end, I remember one instance where Lakshmi Mittal, who's a billionaire Indian based in London, was having trouble acquiring a stake in a French company, and Prime Minister Singh personally intervened. This is a man who, offered concierge services, bespoke services to billionaires, but was somehow blind to the intensifying misery and the horror in the countryside in India, and his government was willing to deploy the armed forces against them. And that celebrating a man such as that strikes me. And in the end, he tried to redefine poverty itself. He said, anybody who lived on more than 30 rupees a day was not poor. And one wondered how much money was being spent on Prime Minister Singh's upkeep on a daily basis, how much money was spent on his food. It seemed very vulgar to celebrate him when you knew the people who were suffering the consequences of his policies. I don't necessarily disagree with everything, but I don't want the victims of his rule to be airbrushed out of history. And during his rule, right now, Graham, in India, if you oppose the prime minister, you're denounced as an anti-national. And I remember clearly that in Prime Minister Singh's time, if you opposed the policies of Prime Minister Singh, you were written off as an anti-development left-wing left-wing lunatic. And I certainly don't consider myself a hard left figure. And yet to meet the people, to travel through India's countryside, was to come into contact with people who just didn't count, who just didn't matter to the government, certainly to Prime Minister Singh.
Well, the second half of your book, Malevolent Republic, deals with Modi's India. Looking at the period before he became Prime Minister, he's state governor in 2002, presiding over time a very severe massacre of Muslims in his state, so severe that the Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration, at that time, refuses him permission to enter the United States. And now here he is in his second term. How did a man with this background become Prime Minister of India?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you. Modi is a believer in, he's a member of the RSS. He joined the RSS as a teenager. He left his mother and his family and wandered off to spread the message of Hindu nationalism. He was one of the original catechists who traveled through India to foment that bottom-up revolution. And he acquired a reputation. There are critics of his who say, now that he's prime minister, that he was lazy back then, but he did acquire a reputation for incredible competence. And he was seconded to the BJP, which is now the ruling party, which is the political arm of the RSS. And he was a brilliant organizer, but he was moved out of Gujarat, and Gujarat is a very prosperous middle-class bastion of Hindu nationalism. He was moved out of that state and to Delhi because he was getting involved in a lot of intrigue in Gujarat, and he was making many of the stakeholders there unhappy. So he was moved to Delhi, where he was given charge for some states in northern India to manage the affairs of the party in those states. In 2001, there was a massive earthquake in Gujarat, and the chief minister of Gujarat was quite incompetent. And what Modi did is he borrowed the jet of an industrialist, arrived at the scene of the earthquake, and got a lot of media attention. And the prime minister of India at the time, who was a Hindu nationalist, a moderate Hindu nationalist, heading a coalition government which tempered his politics, invited Modi, and this is according to Modi, and said to him, I need you to go to Gujarat and run the show there. So he's dispatched in 2001 to run Gujarat. Within months of his arrival, there is a train carrying 58 Hindu pilgrims that is torched, and these 58 bodies are recovered. Before the cause of the arson could be established, Modi blames it on Islamic extremism and cites Newton's third law. He says every action will have an equal and opposite reaction. And within days, Gujarat goes up in smoke. Thousands of Muslims are slaughtered by sword-wielding Hindus. There are stories of pregnant women's bodies being ripped up and fetuses being pulled out. There are stories of mass graves. It's a complete horror show. And Modi becomes a pariah in Indian politics because India still regards itself as a secular state. And there is mounting pressure on the prime minister to sack this man, and the prime minister wants to sack him. He's appalled personally by what Modi has done. If he's not complicit in stoking the violence, he's certainly responsible and incompetent in stopping it from happening. For days, the state burns, and the chief minister is nowhere to be seen. He's about to be sacked when the RSS intervenes and says, no, you cannot sack him. We need him because this is exactly what we've been waiting for all these years, all these decades. Modi stays in place, but he's an untouchable. Nobody wants to go near him. He's a pariah. What he then does is he subordinates his Hindu nationalist fanaticism to this public persona as a competent manager of the economy. He hires an American public relations firm, starts inviting investors to Gujarat. This is a country in which India, it's very important to remember, if you want to start something, if you're an entrepreneur and want to manufacture cars, say, you apply to open a factory, your grandson manufactures the first car. That's how slow moving India's red tapist system is. What Modi does is he offers expedited clearances. You apply for land to open a factory, he'll grant it to you within 3 days. He micromanages everything. And industrialists flock to him because they see him as exactly what India needs, a competent administrator. And they forget, and the history of Gujarat somehow is forgotten and is buried under the accumulating compliments to Modi as the kind of administrator India needs. And some of India's richest, most distinguished billionaires, plutocrats, line up to pay tributes to him, and they say, this is the man India needs. And he is very competently deodorizing his reputation and also using his public relations machinery to spread the idea that Gujarat is the only first world state in India. That's not true. There are many states in India where you could have a better quality of life. But his communications arm is so good that many people start believing. Complement that on the other side with the venality and the corruption and the status of the Congress government being led by Manmohan Singh. By 2013, the Congress government is effectively ground to a halt. There are mass protests everywhere against corruption. Prime Minister Singh, despite his cast iron reputation for incorruptibility, presides over the most corrupt administration in India's history, at least perceived to be the most corrupt administration in India's history. And by 2014, when Modi casts himself as the BJP's candidate for the premiership of India, he runs an inclusive campaign. He doesn't focus as much on Hindu nationalism. He says, I'm a modernizing technocrat who wants to carry all Indians together. And a lot of Indians fall for that. He promises to bring back all the illicit cash stashed in foreign accounts. He promises to transfer the equivalent of £15,000 into the accounts of every Indian. He promises to build Singapore-like cities on the Deccan Plateau, smart cities, he calls them. He promises employment. He casts himself as the antidote to every crisis-talking India. And Indians have reached that point where they are willing to accept this, because Manmohan Singh, after 10 years of Manmohan Singh, wouldn't you?
Well, let's move from some of Modi's promises to the reality of Modi's government. One of the features you draw upon is the erosion of autonomous institutions. In fact, more than erosion, effectively their co-option into the state and into the BJP state at that. Can you flesh that out? Give some examples of exactly what is going on in this respect.
Right. So the autonomous institutions that are fundamental, indispensable to the functioning of the Indian state. Think, for instance, the Election Commission of India. Think, for instance, the Reserve Bank of India, or think even, for instance, the Indian Armed Forces. They've all been politicized in a manner previously unthinkable. The Reserve Bank of India's autonomy was significantly eroded when Modi decided to terminate currency notes in India. He didn't even consult them. Parliament itself has been reduced to a rubber stamping forum. This is why Modi goes to declare his intentions. He doesn't go to debate them. The Indian Army has been politicized. They've used Indian Army successes, which are the successes of the Indian Army. In 1999, when the Indian Army staged attacks against Pakistan, highly successful attacks against Pakistan, certain members of the BJP tried to ascribe that to the party, to the Prime Minister of the time. And the Prime Minister said, no, this is not something we do. These are the successes of the armed forces. But Modi was happy to do that. Modi was willing to, co-opt the Indian Army's successes. And India was about to have its first Muslim chief of the armed forces. Modi intervened and appointed somebody who was junior to him. And the Election Commission has functioned in so many ways as an extension of the government. This institution is a marvel to behold. It is the Election Commission's autonomy that has ensured India's democracy for these many years. And that organization has functioned effectively as an extension of the regime. Modi introduced something called electoral bonds, which allow private corporations to give anonymous donations to political parties. The Election Commission initially objected to this. Within 3 days, it did an about turn and praised it as a step forward in making India transparent. The free press effectively has been shackled. There are severe consequences for pursuing stories that expose the government's failures. Individual journalists, as I detail in this book, have been punished. Careers have ended, and those that have performed as sycophants of the regime have thrived. The careers of those people have thrived. Institution after institutions, universities have been co-opted. These are spaces in which Indians from all corners of the country come and meet and this is where really you realize the richness of being an Indian. And this idea, this Hindu nationalist ideology that, we are one people, diversity is bad, that is being instituted in these institutions of higher learning. Every institution has been debased, and Hindu nationalism, this idea that India is a Hindu nation, has really come to the fore. And police are now spectators to lynch mobs who go around slaughtering Muslims, or because they've allegedly killed a calf or a cow, or they've eaten beef. And I always remember what Ashish Nandi said, something about Modi. Ashish Nandi is a distinguished author and a trained clinical psychologist. He met Modi when Modi was a mere campaigner for the RSS, and he said, after meeting Modi, he said, Modi met virtually all the criteria that psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and psychologists had set up after years of empirical work on the authoritarian personality. He had the same mix of puritanical rigidity, narrowing of emotional life, massive use of the ego, defensive projection, denial, and fear of his own passions combined with fantasies of violence, all set within the matrix of clear, paranoid, and obsessive personality traits. I still remember the cool, measured tone in which he elaborated a theory of cosmic conspiracy against India that painted every Muslim as a suspected traitor and a potential terrorist. Nandi said he emerged from the interview shaken. He had met a textbook case of a fascist and a prospective killer, perhaps even a future mass murderer. And the Prime Minister hasn't been leading a mob, but every time a mob goes and slaughters Muslims or minorities or harasses or harries them, the Prime Minister doesn't utter a word. He has never once memorialized by name a Muslim devoured by the passions he has aroused.
Well, Modi has paid you the possibly backhanded compliment of starting following you on Twitter. I think you're one of about 2,000 people he follows, whereas in return he's followed by, amongst active political leaders in the world, he's got the largest following of anyone on Twitter. I'm not sure he's going to like what he sees from you. I don't know whether you should be concerned that he's following you, but there is a reason he's been re-elected with a thumping majority, and obviously you'll say he's unleashed many of the negative aspects of humankind, but I mean there must be some positive reasons for why otherwise normal people vote for someone you describe as having the psychopathy of a fascist leader.
Yeah, I mean there are many people vote for him because primarily, Graham, India is a heavily stratified society. Ambedkar said Hinduism is not a religion; it is a collection of communities, and each community refuses effectively to recognize each other, except when there are Hindu-Muslim riots. What Modi's great achievement is politically is to attenuate these walls between Hindu communities. So he has created a Hindu electorate. He's created a Hindu voting bloc. An overwhelming majority of Indians did not vote for him, but the overwhelming majority of Indians, the vote is split, and he has got that vote. So that explains why he is in power and why he's able to win re-elections. As far as any good thing he's done, yes, he's done several things that are good. One of the things I particularly applaud him for is he has stopped, or certainly, sorry, let me just clarify this. One of the things I initially applauded him for was his unwillingness to accept terrorist assaults on Indian soil. And I say this because in 2009, Bombay, India's financial capital, was besieged for 72 hours, and India did nothing. These were men who arrived from Pakistan, cooped up, slaughtered 160 people in the financial capital of India, and India had absolutely no response. And we got into the habit of rationalizing our failure to respond to this as some sort of a virtue. And Modi has ended that. He has conveyed that if you attack India, there will be consequences. Certainly, that was initially the message he passed on, but subsequently, we've seen that he's tried to again use those achievements for squalid political gain. And last year, when China effectively seized 100,000 square kilometers of Indian territory, India's size shrunk. Modi was lying to Indians and hiding that fact from Indians and hiding in his office and saying, China has done nothing wrong. So that initial sense of gratitude that a particular way of thinking and looking at the world had come to an end in India, sadly has again reasserted itself. I'm not a warmonger, but I certainly believe that when India becomes a victim of brazen terror assaults, sitting and not doing anything actually harms secularists, because if it is precisely because secularists fail to respond with conviction and force to assaults by a state that is constitutionally a theocratic state, effectively, that their cause is discredited. And if secularists will not do the job of securing India, voters will eventually hire Hindu nationalists to do that job. And that is one of the reasons Modi was voted into power. Initially, that was one of the things I applauded him for, but eventually I've realized that I was wrong to applaud him for that. And there's one more thing I just want to add. There's an old Jewish joke about the Plotkin diamond. I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but two ladies meet at the barber's, and one of them spots a beautiful diamond on the finger of another and says, tell me, that's such a beautiful diamond, tell me about it. And she says, this is the Plotkin diamond. It has a great story attached to it. It was, it belonged to kings and countesses and princess, and now it's passed down to us. But the Plotkin diamond comes with a curse. And she says, oh, how mysterious. Tell me, what is the curse? She says, the Plotkin diamond comes with Mr. Plotkin. And I think any achievement of Modi's comes with Modi, and that in itself is a negative for me, because I would rather these accomplishments were the work of secularists and inclusive leaders, not of a sectarian demagogue.
Well, even aside, if one can put it aside, as the future of secularism of secular government in India, is there a danger that actually the ultimate consequence of Modi's particular brand of nationalism, of Hindu nationalism, is not the great unity of India, but its separation, its balkanization?
Oh, that's such an excellent question, Graham. I will say that what we call secularism in India was not the obsession of a deracinated elite. It is the condition of India's unity. It is precisely because India was a secular state that it was able to convince Christians in Nagaland, Muslims in Kashmir, Sikhs in Punjab, Buddhists in Sikkim to come into one union and call themselves Indian. You can belong to any religion, any caste, you can speak any language and still say you're Indian, because your Indianness is not premised on one religion or one language. And once you start introducing a Hindu first ideology, which says Hindu is the natural language of Indians, Hindi is the natural language of Indians, Hinduism is the natural faith of Indians, why should the Muslims in Kashmir, the Buddhists in Sikkim, the Christians in Nagaland see themselves as part of India? What is the basis of Indian unity after that? People will eventually recoil. I remember Sheikh Abdullah, the great Kashmiri leader who rallied Kashmiris after partition of India. Kashmir was an independent state. Pakistan waged a war to try and wrest it. And Sheikh Abdullah led a movement led Kashmir's accession to India. He, in his inaugural speech, when he was voted into power in the first free election in Kashmir, he said that Kashmiris will never accept a principle which seeks to favor the interests of one religion or social group against another. That was directed then at Pakistan, because Pakistan was seeking to favor people of one community, Muslims. And he said the reason Kashmiris will join India is because India is a non-confessional state. It is religiously neutral. It sees everyone as part of one family. That is the reason we are joining India. But today, when India becomes a de facto Hindu state, when Kashmiris look at India, they see a country where Muslims are lynched for eating beef, when Christians are tarnished as anti-Indian, when Sikhs demanding, the revocation of legislation, which is their democratic right in Delhi right now, they are painted as fifth columnists. How can you conceivably argue that India? What is the argument for Indian unity? There was a time when Kashmiri separatists could be painted as chauvinists. They didn't want to be part of India because that was their problem. They saw themselves as Muslim and therefore they wanted to build walls around themselves. They were too good, too pure to want to, contaminate themselves by contact with other Indians. So they were too exalted to be part of India and they wanted to be separate. You could say that about Kashmiri separatists. You can't now because the argument of Indian unity, that you can be Indian regardless of the religion, is not even theoretically available to Modi, who is a Hindu nationalist. He believes in the primacy of Hindus. That is the ideology he subscribes to. How can you conceivably convince Indians of different faiths, different languages, to pledge allegiance, to say, I'm Indian first and foremost? And this is something I think a lot about because you look at the experience of Yugoslavia, Graham, you're familiar with it. Mrs. Gandhi used to say that Yugoslavia is the one country in the world that is most like India because there are multiple faiths, multiple languages, and yet they come together. And you come across a figure such as Milosevic, who is so strikingly similar to Modi, and the grievances of Serbian nationalists that are so strikingly similar to the grievances of Hindu nationalists. They never recover from the arrival of Islam and the defeat of Lazar to Sultan Murad in 1389 on the fields of Kosovo. Similarly, Hindu nationalists have never recovered from the ravages of Islamic invasions of India. They effectively devour Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia's balkanization results in 6 different countries. And what Indians think, a lot of Indians think that India's unity is divinely ordained. That is not true. India experienced partition just 7 decades ago. India was partitioned in the name of religion. India's culture is antique. India's unity is rare and recent. India experienced unity for the first time throughout its territory when Britain was running India. And Congress effectively inherited that without Pakistan and Bangladesh. India's unity is rare and recent. And unless we cherish that and protect the basis upon which that unity is founded, we can very well squander that unity. And that unity should never be taken for granted. And Modi has, I think, activated the dynamite of balkanization that has always lain beneath the surface.
Well, we've got some questions from listeners, which I'd like to draw in and ask you, Kapil. One comes from Shailesh Kumar, who asks, generally it is believed that two-party systems are more vulnerable to autocratization than multi-party systems. Why has Indian political plurality been unable to prevent this trend?
Well, I think Indian political plurality did prevent it for as long as it could. Hindu nationalism breaks through in the 1980s. Hindu national BJP is the sole competitor on a pan-national level to the Congress party. But then you see the emergence of parties founded, devoted to linguistic pride in southern India and caste-based justice in northern India. It is the vote they take away from Hindu nationalists that prevents the emergence of Hindu nationalists. And their power has diminished over the years. And it is partly because the Congress party, which was for decades the default party of government in India, has become a family fief. And when there is no alternative, and that template has been replicated by other parties. And the BJP is the only party that is truly meritocratic, or was, until Modi converted it into his own fief now. That is part of the reason, I think, that explains the lack of resistance to the BJP. There is now no party. There are very few regional parties that can take on the BJP. There is one in Orissa, one in Andhra, there is one in Tamil Nadu, but eventually I think BJP will make progress in those states.
Another question is the 130th birthday of Ambedkar. How relevant is Ambedkar to India today, and particularly in relation to Modi's BJP?
Oh, he's incredibly relevant. I rather fear he's been reduced in death to his caste alone, which was a huge part of his identity. I mean, he led a great movement for the emancipation of his community, but I see him as one of India's most important and most enlightened founders. His gift for clarity is unmatched among any of India's founders, and he wanted Indians to be ready to be citizens. He feared that the Constitution was putting the cart before the horse, but he also devised a constitution that made citizens of a people who had only known subjection. Right now, he's being used as a tool of radical left-wing politics in India, but he himself, despite his radical politics, wanted India to embrace a very conservatively constitutional way of functioning. He didn't have a lot of appetite for the kind of rabble-rousing Modi engages in, or the kind of rabble-rousing Mrs. Gandhi engaged in. His message of emancipation, of course, remains incredibly relevant to all of us, especially over the past 7 years. Caste never disappeared, and it has once again congealed into a severe threat to the harmony of India, and I think Ambedkar remains timeless and incredibly relevant. And I think one of the things we lack in India is an accessible one-volume biography of Ambedkar, and I think someone ought to take that project up. Not me, but somebody who can make him accessible, because he remains this mysterious figure whom culture has deposited in your mind, but what he actually stood for, his life, his struggle, is known only to a handful of people, to a handful of scholars.
Well, a penultimate question, and that is, often people feel that they feel threatened when there's an external force, and they turn to strong leaders as a result. Obviously, thinking about Modi in this context, but the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, has clearly created this a dimension of this threat. How is India, or how has Modi in particular dealt with the threat from the COVID pandemic?
I think COVID has granted him the opportunity to formalize his authoritarian strongman rule. I'll explain how. When the coronavirus marched out of China and was already killing people in India's neighborhood, Modi was busy welcoming Donald Trump, toppling a government in central India, and also presiding over a riot in the capital of India. India was ill-prepared for this pandemic. The first orders for essential equipment was placed after Modi announced a lockdown, which was announced with a 4-hour notice. It was the largest lockdown in human history, the most stringent lockdown in human history. It was announced with a 4-hour notice, which led to a mass exodus of working class Indians who came from the towns and villages of India to work in the cities, to make a living and to send it back home. They fled the cities because they didn't have food to eat. 16 people were mowed down by a train. Thousands of people perished just walking of exhaustion. He had not made any arrangements for them. They hadn't even occurred to him. And this is a man who says, he's the leader of the poor. The pictures of millions of Indians on the march were redolent of the mass migration during India's partition. There's never been anything like it. What the Prime Minister did, though, after he went to the Supreme Court asking it to order the Indian government not to print anything that contradicted the Indian government's statistics on the coronavirus. He effectively wanted the press to function as a bulletin board for his announcements. Parliament effectively was suspended. Then what he did is he announced the creation of something called a fund called PM Cares. The name is so brazen, it would have taken aback someone like Papadoc de Vallier. He invited Indians to make contributions to that fund, which was created, he said, to help the poorest of the poor. And within the first week alone, $1 billion went into that fund. Companies that laid off workers unable to pay them wages actually directed money, their cash reserves, into that fund. And people who gave money to that fund were given tax breaks by the government. But that fund itself was created as a private trust. So the State Auditor of India is not able to find out how the money was spent, where the money was spent. Modi claims he's personally incorruptible, but we know what the money will be used for. It'll be used to corrupt Indian democracy even more. And whatever safeguards there were for workers in India were diluted under the cover of the pandemic. And this pandemic has revealed, right now, India is the worst hotspot at this moment as we speak for this virus. And this pandemic has revealed not only that Modi is malign, but he's also cosmically incompetent. He's the most incompetent leader in India's history. There's absolutely no one who can beat him, who can beat him. This is the time during the pandemic that China seized 100,000 kilometers of Indian territory. India's size shrunk, as I mentioned. Hundreds of millions. India's economy has shrunk. There's a calamity of joblessness, and the Prime Minister lives in a detached universe of his own, where he says the world looks to India as a model. The vaccination drive in India is a sad joke. And I think it's revealed to Indians, this pandemic, that Modi is not only malign, he's incompetent, but, Graham, he might still be popular because there is no opposition to mobilize the resentment against the Prime Minister into a meaningful vote against his party.
Well, we're drawing to a close, Capel, but in doing so, I'd like to quote from your own book, if I may, to quote some words, not back at you, but at you and with the audience. And you say, unless the Republic is reclaimed, the time will come when all of us will be one incorrect meal, one interfaith romance, one unfortunate misstep away from being extinguished. The mobs that slaughtered bad Muslims will eventually come for the Hindus who are not good. It's a pretty bleak assessment. Do you have any hope that the secular ideals that the founding fathers of modern India held true can be revived? You've just spoken a moment ago about the lack of a strong opposition to Modi. Is there still a hope in your heart?
Yes. Modi's first term in office, 2014 to 2019, was a period of subversion of institutions, as we discussed. Modi's second term in office, starting 2019, has been a period of citizenry backlash. India is not a country where democracy is dying. The constitution is dying. India is a country where democracy is flaring. There are protests everywhere. When Modi amended the Citizenship Act, there were protests up and down the country. There were Muslim women who got together to protest against the government. The constitution was their holy book. The Indian flag was their holy symbol. The national anthem was their holy song. That was an inspiring moment. But the greatest tragedy in India is not the presence of an authoritarian, tyrannically inclined leader. Most countries, every leader, I think, has desires to be a strongman, to be a dictator. As George Bush put it, it would be a lot easier to be that than to be a Democrat. But their dictatorial tendencies are tempered by, are reined in by a competent opposition. India's tragedy today is the absence of a competent opposition. The Congress party is run for the benefit of one family. That is India's great tragedy. This is the party that negotiated India's freedom from Britain, and today it exists primarily to provide subsistence to one family. And as long as that remains the case, an organic uprising against Modi will not appear anytime soon. It takes decades, Graham, for an opposition to come into being. We have an opposition party. We just need to reclaim it. And if enough people in the Congress party, I know there are good people in the Congress party, want to topple this dynasty and put forward a competent leadership, if Congress goes to the electorate with Rahul Gandhi once again. Rahul Gandhi has been rejected twice. To go back to the electorate the third time with the same man is not to offer an alternative, it is to offer an insult to the electorate. The electorate will once again reject him. If congressmen and women love India, they must topple this dynasty, and the road to reclaiming in India goes through Congress party. If we can reclaim Congress, which is our heritage, we can reclaim the country, because that is the only asset we have left to take on the Prime Minister. I'm hopeful that that may happen.
Well, Kapil, I'm glad to end on a hopeful note. I've read Malevolent Republic. Every page, if I may say so, every page has got something fascinating, interesting, beautiful. Even when you're angry, you still remain eloquent, and your writing style is a real joy to behold. I can't tell you how much I've learned about India from reading Malevolent Republic. It's been a tremendous joy to read the book, and a real pleasure to talk with you today. I'm going to hand back to Evan at Booksmith now, but Kapil Komireddi, again, an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Graham. It's been nothing short of an honor to be in conversation with you, and thanks to everyone who attended this talk.
Thank you, Kapil and Graham. Kapil, congratulations again on the book, and this has been a really enlightening and inspiring conversation. Also, I encourage you who are watching to get the book Malevolent Republic, Booksmith, or from if you don't get it from us, get it somewhere. The link is just below the video. Thank you for joining us, and I hope we can meet up in person at some point in the nearest future. But Kapil, perhaps for the next book. But until then, stay well and safe, everyone, and take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.